train moved through the Siberian night like a ghost, its steel wheels grinding against frozen rails with a rhythm that had echoed across the Soviet Union for decades. 3 locomotives, 16 freight cars, painted the same faded industrial grey as thousands of other cargo trains crisscrossing the vast Russian interior. From a distance through falling snow, it looked ordinary, anonymous. Just another freight convoy carrying coal or timber or machinery across the emptiness between Moscow and Vladivostok. Then, on a remote stretch of track 300 kilometers from the nearest town, the train stopped. Not at a station, not at a depot, just stopped in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by birch forest and darkness. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. The locomotives idled. Snow accumulated on the roofs of the freight cars. The only sound was wind through bare trees and the quiet hiss of hydraulic systems warming up inside the third car from the rear. At 0347 hours, the roof of that car split open. 2 massive doors, each weighing 15 tons, hinged upward and locked vertical. Inside the car, a cylinder began rising on a hydraulic platform, emerging from the freight car like something from a nightmare. 30 meters tall, 2 meters in diameter, white frost sublimating from its surface in the cold air. The SS-24 Scalpel intercontinental ballistic missile, capable of carrying 10 nuclear warheads, each independently targetable, reached its firing position in 90 seconds. The missile didn't launch. This was a drill, but the message was clear. Somewhere in the Soviet Union, moving constantly across 60,000 kilometers of railway, were trains that could end the world. And for most of the 1980s, the United States had no idea where they were, how many existed, or how to stop them. This was the BZHRK, the Boyevой Железнодорожный Ракетный Комплекс, Combat Railway Missile Complex, the most audacious mobile weapon system ever deployed. The Soviets called it the nuclear shield on rails. Western intelligence agencies, when they finally understood what they were facing, called it a strategic nightmare. The concept seemed absurd when rumors first reached NATO intelligence in the early 1980s. Nuclear missiles hidden in freight trains, moving randomly through the Soviet rail network. It sounded like science fiction, like propaganda, like the paranoid fantasy of a collapsing empire. Then the satellites captured images that couldn't be explained. Train convoys with unusual security, freight cars with reinforced suspension, rail yards with radiation signatures. And gradually, piece by piece, Western analysts assembled the truth. The Soviets had solved the fundamental problem of nuclear deterrence. How do you hide weapons powerful enough to destroy civilization in a world where satellites can photograph license plates from orbit? The answer was elegant and terrifying. You put them on trains and keep them moving. The logic behind the BZHRK emerged from Soviet strategic paranoia that was grounded in uncomfortable reality. By the early 1980s, American surveillance technology had become sophisticated enough to locate and track fixed Soviet missile installations with precision. The SS-18 Satan missiles, the backbone of Soviet deterrence, sat in hardened silos that American satellites could photograph, that American intelligence could catalogue, that American missiles could target. If war came, the United States could launch a first strike aimed at destroying Soviet ICBMs in their silos before they could be launched. The entire Soviet nuclear deterrent could theoretically be eliminated in 30 minutes. Soviet strategic planners understood that deterrence only worked if retaliation was guaranteed. If the Americans believed they could destroy Soviet missiles before launch, the psychological balance of mutual assured destruction collapsed. The solution was mobility. Weapons that moved constantly were impossible to target with the precision required for first strike scenarios. The Soviets had already deployed road-mobile missiles like the SS-20, but roads limited operational range, and made convoys visible to aerial surveillance. Railways offered advantages roads couldn't match. The Soviet Union possessed the world's second-largest rail network, over 140,000 kilometers of track, connecting every region of the country. Trains could travel thousands of kilometers, changing routes randomly, disappearing into the vast interior where satellite coverage was intermittent. The rail system's redundancy meant that destroying sections of track wouldn't prevent the trains from finding alternative routes. And critically, the Soviet rail network already handled thousands of freight trains daily, providing perfect camouflage for weapon systems disguised as civilian cargo. The engineering challenges were formidable. An SS-24 missile weighed over 104 tons. The launch canister and support equipment added another 40 tons. The entire system, including the missile car, control car, and power generation, required 3 heavily reinforced freight cars. These cars needed to handle not just the static weight, but the dynamic forces of train movement, the thermal stresses of Siberian winters and Central Asian summers, and the violent shock of missile launch that would generate forces that could derail a normal train. The Yuzhnoye Design Bureau, responsible for Soviet ballistic missile development, worked with railway engineering institutes to create a system that could survive these stresses. The missile cars featured suspension systems with 4 times the shock absorption capacity of standard freight cars. The launch canister was mounted on a hydraulic platform that could compensate for track irregularities, ensuring the missile would launch vertically even if the train was on a grade. The cars were climate controlled, maintaining precise temperature and humidity to preserve the missile's readiness regardless of external conditions. The disguise was crucial. The missile cars looked nearly identical to standard refrigerated freight cars, the type used to transport perishable goods across the Soviet Union. The roof doors were carefully engineered to be invisible when closed, with gaps filled with materials that matched the visual and thermal signature of normal freight car roofs. The missile trains travelled with civilian freight traffic, stopping at normal rail yards, following standard train schedules. From the outside, they were indistinguishable from the thousands of cargo trains that moved across Soviet rails daily. The command and control systems were as sophisticated as the mechanical engineering. Each train was essentially a mobile missile base, carrying everything needed to receive launch orders, authenticate them, and execute them independently. The command car contained communications equipment, fire control computers, and the launch control consoles operated by Strategic Rocket Forces officers. Encrypted communications allowed the trains to receive orders from Central Command while moving, using systems that piggybacked on standard railway communications infrastructure. The crews lived aboard the trains during deployments that could last weeks. Officers and enlisted personnel from the Strategic Rocket Forces, railway troops, and security forces, all confined to the cramped interiors of modified freight cars. They maintained the missiles, monitored systems, conducted drills, and waited for orders that they hoped would never come. The psychological burden was immense. They were the ultimate fail-safe, the guarantee that if the Soviet Union was attacked, retaliation would be certain. They carried the apocalypse, and they knew it. The first BZHRK trains became operational in 1987. Designated RT-23, UTTH by the Soviets, SS-24 Scalpel by NATO. Each train carried 3 missiles. Each missile carried 10 warheads. Each warhead had a yield of 550 kilotons, roughly 40 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. A single train could destroy 30 cities. The Soviet Union deployed 12 trains, representing a strategic capability equivalent to 360 Hiroshimas, constantly moving through the Soviet interior. American intelligence agencies detected unusual activity at Soviet rail facilities in 1985, but didn't immediately understand what they were observing. Satellite imagery showed train convoys with heavy security, radiation signatures suggesting nuclear materials, but the trains looked like ordinary freight. It wasn't until 1987, when the first BZHRK trains became operational, and Soviet officials hinted at their existence during arms control negotiations, that the CIA realized what the Soviets had achieved. The strategic implications were profound and disturbing. The United States had spent billions developing surveillance systems capable of tracking Soviet missile forces. Those systems were optimized to find fixed installations or slow-moving road vehicles. They were not designed to track individual freight trains moving at 60 kilometers per hour across a rail network the size of North America. Even with America's satellite constellation, continuous tracking of all Soviet freight traffic was impossible. The BZHRK trains could disappear into the daily flow of railway commerce and become effectively invisible. American strategic planners conducted simulations to assess how many BZHRK trains could be destroyed in a first strike scenario. The results were sobering. Even with perfect intelligence about train locations, which was unrealistic, and even with successful strikes against all known trains, which was optimistic, the probability of destroying all trains before they could launch was essentially zero. The trains' mobility and camouflage made them the most survivable nuclear delivery system ever deployed. One train, somewhere in Siberia, could guarantee devastating retaliation. And the United States had no way to ensure that all trains were accounted for. The psychological impact on American defense establishment was significant. For years, strategic planning had assumed that Soviet nuclear forces could be located, tracked, and targeted. The BZHRK trains broke those assumptions. They represented weapons that were genuinely survivable, truly capable of assured retaliation, impossible to preemptively destroy. The strategic balance that had been tilting toward American advantage through technological superiority was suddenly more uncertain. The irony was that the United States had considered similar concepts decades earlier. In the 1960s, the US Air Force studied the Missile-Mobile, a program to deploy Minuteman ICBMs on trains that would move through the American rail network. The concept was technically feasible, but political and practical problems killed it. American railroads were privately owned, densely populated areas surrounded most rail lines, and public opposition to nuclear weapons traveling through cities was predictable and intense. The program was cancelled in 1962 without deploying any systems. Soviet planners didn't face these constraints. The Soviet rail system was state-owned. Most routes crossed sparsely populated regions where public opinion was irrelevant and security was easily maintained. The vast empty spaces of Siberia and Central Asia provided operational areas where trains could move for hundreds of kilometers without encountering civilian population centers. What was impossible in America was practical in the Soviet Union. The BZHRK trains operated under strict protocols. They never traveled through major cities. Their routes were planned to keep them in remote areas where security could be maintained and where accidental nuclear incidents wouldn't affect large populations. They operated on schedules that appeared random, but were actually carefully coordinated with Strategic Rocket Forces Command. They maintained constant communication through encrypted channels, ready to receive launch orders at any moment, but designed to ensure that accidental or unauthorized launches were impossible. The crews underwent psychological screening more rigorous than submarine crews or silo-based missile operators. They lived in isolation for weeks at a time, maintaining machinery that they hoped would never be used, conducting drills that simulated the end of civilization. Some officers who served on BZHRK trains later described the experience as surreal. Living in modified freight cars, maintaining nuclear missiles, moving through the Russian landscape while disguised as civilian traffic, knowing that if they ever received launch orders, the world as they knew it would be ending. The technical reliability of the BZHRK system was remarkable. The trains operated in temperatures ranging from -50 degrees Celsius in Siberian winters to +40 degrees in Central Asian summers. They cross terrain from sea level to mountain passes. The missiles and launch systems maintained readiness throughout, a testament to Soviet engineering that Western analysts had often dismissed as inferior to American technology. The BZHRK trains proved that when Soviet designers had clear requirements and adequate resources, they could create systems as sophisticated as anything the West produced. Arms control negotiations in the late 1980s struggled to address the BZHRK systems. American negotiators argued that rail-mobile missiles violated the spirit of strategic arms treaties because they couldn't be effectively verified. Soviet negotiators countered that road-mobile missiles, which the United States accepted, posed identical verification challenges. The START-Wide Treaty, signed in 1991, allowed both sides to retain mobile missiles, but imposed limits on numbers and required notifications of their general deployment areas. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created immediate questions about the BZHRK trains. Who controlled them? Where were they? What happened to trains that might be in remote areas during the political chaos of Soviet dissolution? Russian authorities assured the United States that all trains were secure, that control had been maintained throughout the transition, that there was no possibility of unauthorized use. But the assurances were thin, and American intelligence agencies spent anxious months confirming that all BZHRK trains were accounted for and under Russian control. The economic chaos of the 1990s, Russia made maintaining the BZHRK fleet impossible. The trains required constant maintenance, regular missile inspections, crew training, operational exercises. Russia's defense budget collapsed, priorities shifted to preserving minimal deterrent forces, and the BZHRK program was too expensive to sustain. Between 2003 and 2007, Russia decommissioned the entire BZHRK fleet. The trains were dismantled, the missiles removed and destroyed, the specialized railcars cut up for scrap. Western arms control advocates celebrated the BZHRK's end, arguing that rail-mobile missiles were destabilizing and impossible to verify. But Russian military planners never abandoned the concept. The strategic logic that made BZHRK attractive in the 1980s remained valid in the 21st century. Mobility provided survivability. Survivability ensured deterrence. And Russia's strategic position, surrounded by NATO expansion and American missile defense systems, made survivable weapons increasingly important. In 2012, Russia announced development of a new rail-mobile missile system, the Barguzin, named after powerful winds that sweep across Lake Baikal. The system would use new missiles, modern electronics, improved camouflage, but the fundamental concept was unchanged. Hide ICBMs on trains, move them constantly through the Russian rail network, make them impossible to target preemptively. Development continued through the 2010s, though Russian officials provided few details about testing or deployment timelines. Then, in 2017, Russia quietly announced that Barguzin development had been suspended due to budget constraints and changing strategic priorities. Whether this represented genuine cancellation or was deception to reduce Western concern remained unclear. Satellite imagery occasionally captured images of trains at facilities associated with the Barguzin program, suggesting that work might be continuing despite official statements. The legacy of the BZHRK extends beyond the specific trains to the broader concept of mobile strategic weapons. The success of road-mobile missiles like Russia's RS-24 Yars and China's DF-31 demonstrates that mobility remains central to modern nuclear strategy. American proposals for mobile Minuteman missiles, abandoned in the 1960s, have been revived in recent strategic discussions as concerns about Chinese and Russian counterforce capabilities have grown. The rail-mobile concept that seemed absurd when Soviets first deployed it is now recognized as strategically sound, perhaps even inevitable. The trains themselves, those original BZHRK systems from the 1980s, are gone. Dismantled, destroyed, reduced to scrap metal and fading memories. The rail yards where they were maintained have been converted to other uses or abandoned. The crews who operated them have aged, some passing away, others carrying memories of service aboard weapons systems that could have ended civilization but never fired in anger. The specialized freight cars that hid missiles are gone, though occasionally photographs emerge on Russian military forums showing rusting hulks in remote rail yards, remnants of the Cold War's strangest weapons platform. But the concept remains. Somewhere in military planning offices in Moscow, and perhaps in Beijing and Washington as well, strategists consider the advantages of rail-mobile strategic weapons. The mathematics that made the BZHRK attractive haven't changed. Mobility provides survivability. Survivability ensures deterrence. Railways offer concealment that roads cannot match. The technology is proven. The challenges are understood. If strategic competition intensifies, if arms control breaks down completely, if nations again seek absolute assurance that retaliation is possible regardless of first strike, the apocalypse on rails might ride again. They laughed when intelligence reports first described Soviet plans. Nuclear missiles on trains, hidden in freight cars, moving through the civilian rail network. It sounded like something from a spy novel, too impractical to take seriously, too absurd to actually build. Western analysts calculated that the engineering challenges were insurmountable, that the costs would be prohibitive, that even if built, the trains would be easily detected and tracked. They stopped laughing when the first BZHRK train rolled out of its assembly facility in 1987, when satellites captured images of trains that couldn't be explained, when Soviet officials confirmed what American intelligence had suspected, when simulations showed that the trains were effectively impossible to preemptively destroy, when the realization hit that the Soviets had solved the fundamental problem of nuclear survivability through elegant engineering and strategic insight. For decades, those trains moved through the night, carrying payloads that could destroy civilization, operated by crews who lived with the weight of potential apocalypse, hidden in plain sight among thousands of ordinary freight convoys. They represented deterrence at its purest and most terrifying. Weapons that couldn't be found, couldn't be destroyed, could only be feared. They were the ultimate expression of Cold War logic, the recognition that survival depended on guaranteeing that no victory was possible, that any war would end in mutual annihilation. The trains are silent now. The tracks they travelled still carry freight across the Russian expanse. The missiles they carried are gone, destroyed in accordance with arms control treaties. The crews who operated them have moved on to other duties or retirement. But the memory persists. The knowledge that for years the end of the world rode quietly through the Siberian darkness, disguised as ordinary commerce, ready but never used, the ultimate failsafe in a war that thankfully remained cold. They thought it was just a train, but it was the apocalypse on rails, and for decades it moved through the night, unseen and unstoppable. The guarantee that deterrence was real and retaliation was certain.